Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, April the 20th. Where's Samantha Niblett when you need her? The author we learned last week of the Summer of Sex strategy. I do wonder if Number 10 has been in touch with her, hoping for a second dead cat in as many weeks. I fear they need it. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
I can't top that. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Keir Starmer will face the Commons today on the question of Peter Mandelson's vetting ahead of his appointment as US ambassador, 5 days after Keir Starmer's premiership was plunged once more again into crisis over the disgraced peer. That's our main topic this morning. Also, do stay tuned because I have some details of the possible upcoming big reshuffle by Kemi Badenoch.
Okay, that sounds like an important bit that we'll all end up bookmarking. Stay tuned for that later in the podcast. It's a bit lower down because, of course, there's one big story this morning, and that's the aftermath of Thursday's jolting revelation of The Guardian that after months of reassurance that due process was followed, Peter Mandelson failed the official vetting process, yet was still given clearance and with it the job of ambassador to Washington. That's dominated the last few days' political coverage. On Thursday night, Keir Starmer personally phoned the top official in the Foreign Office to pin the blame on him and sack Olly Robbins for not telling him that Mandelson failed the vetting process because we believe of stuff that UKSV found out about Peter Mandelson's work with foreign firms.
But Robbins has been fighting back. He's insisting he did nothing wrong in his role as permanent secretary. He is considering legal action over the dismissal, two of the most senior former mandarins around, Gus O'Donnell and Kieran Martin, leading the charge in public. Also Simon MacDonald, a predecessor at the Foreign Office, saying that the Prime Minister has thrown his colleague under a bus. So days of tricky coverage and turf war ahead for the Prime Minister.
So it's one of those stories where Downing Street is fighting with a new piece of evidence or piece of recent history every few hours. The latest sees Downing Street produce new legal advice saying that there was no impediment to the Prime Minister being told about the security decision. The Times reporting also that Robbins had the very top level of clearance, so evidence that points both in defence of the Prime Minister and in the case for the prosecution. Just on that business of the top level of clearance, Anne, I did hear that in practice, Peter Mandelson didn't see the most sensitive stuff. It's sometimes hard to quite get sort of square every circle on security stuff because people give you part of the story. But what is certain this morning is that cabinet ministers have been circling the wagons to protect the Prime Minister because they know that this is a bad episode for him.
The irony here that we have former permanent secretaries effectively attacking someone in Keir Starmer who had that status, that equivalent status, before he was a politician in his role as DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions. And the PM is often accused of sounding a bit more like a civil servant or an official than a politician. Well, today he really needs to shake that off because the battle will rage when he appears before the Commons at some point after 3:30 this afternoon. Olly Robbins will be before the Foreign Affairs Committee tomorrow. A playbook hearing that the Number 10's comms strategy here is to maintain an element of surprise about how Starmer will approach his moment in the spotlight. Someone there telling us that this is Starmer's day. So they're actually amping up the drum roll. It sounds as if they think, Sam, that the Prime Minister can deliver a knockout blow.
But we'll see how he fares later today. I just thought before we got onto the sort of grist of it, I give you a bit of a historical context. A friend was in touch with me over the weekend about a neat historical parallel. In the late 1970s, in Jim Callaghan's government, there was another high-profile political appointment to be our man in Washington. That time, it was Peter Jay. He was Jim Callaghan's son-in-law, arguably zero relevant experience bar the tag of cleverest young man in Britain, but also, of course, the charge of nepotism followed him all the way through. But here's the thing. I'm told that Peter Jay could not get full security clearance post-vetting, and that meant that he couldn't go into the MI6 offices in the embassy. So there's a precedent there. Incidentally, he lasted barely 2 years as ambassador as well, but that was more because of the fall of Callaghan's government to Thatcher.
I think he was that kind of clever young man when he was actually called the cleverest young man in England and was said to have replied, was there someone cleverer in Wales? Pub quiz special. That's just really interesting parallel, going to show that there's never entirely a first time for anything, except I would say the difference is that there were not red flags in plain sight about Jay in the way that there clearly were about the shape-shifting figure of Peter Mandelson and his business interests and some of his personal connections. And let's not forget, it was only in September 24, as in the run-up to this appointment being made, he gave a speech in Hong Kong, Mandelson did, claiming that there was a rule of law and independence of judiciary in the city, which was a bit of a wow claim, giving the clear oppression of China in the past few years. And he was pressed on that by a journalist that I know, and his team claimed it was grandiloquence of the moment. But I think it did spark worries about his relationship with Beijing via his global council, his previous company. And the day after the sacking of Olly Robbins, on Friday morning, you were with the PM in Paris. He was there for a virtual conference on the Straits of Hormuz, but ended up, of course, talking to Sam Coates for the pool. And the reason that I throw that back to you, Sam, is that I think his tone, as I heard that, gives us a hint of how he's likely to approach his moment in the Sun in the Commons today. So we thought we'd play an extract of that to tee it up.
Prime Minister, politicians resign when they mislead the public and mislead Parliament. Are you considering your position?
That I wasn't told that Peter Mandelson had failed security vetting when he's appointed is staggering. That I wasn't told that he'd failed security vetting when I was telling Parliament that due process had been followed is unforgivable. Not only was I not told, no minister was told. And I'm absolutely furious about that. What I intend to do is to go to Parliament on Monday to set out all the relevant facts in true transparency so Parliament has the full picture.
Prime Minister, why do you always end up sounding like the passenger in this government rather than the driver? Are you really expecting us to believe that a senior civil servant off his own back, without any sort of direction about the importance of Peter Mandelson being ambassador, unilaterally overruled security vetting to approve a political appointment? And they made clear it was political.
I was not told that he had failed security vetting. No minister was told that he had failed security vetting. Number 10 wasn't told that he had failed security vetting.
So that's Keir Starmer at his most cross. I mean, it wasn't one, if I'm just lifting the lid a little bit about it. It wasn't one of those interviews where there were any pleasantries at all, and he walked straight off after we finished. But, I think, he is projecting anger because that's the right political strategy to adopt at this moment. But Labour MPs think he's in a spot. He says he was angry because he wasn't told about the decision, even though he told people due process was followed on camera and in the Commons time and time again. I just want to sort of reassert the sort of big picture as I see it here. Look, what is going on? In October, November, and December 2024, Number 10 indicated it wanted to appoint Peter Mandelson as our man in Washington. And it was presented with a huge array of people telling them not to. Cabinet ministers, spooks, officials in vetting reports. And each one of them raised major red flags. But Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney made clear that they just weren't interested in any objection and that this appointment must go ahead at all costs. So Mandelson's appointment was announced in mid-December 2024. But the vetting that we're now focused on came later at the end of January 2025, so after the announcement. Vetting of ambassadors is the responsibility of the Foreign Office, and in big cases, Olly Robbins. One bit of the system, UKSV, UK Security Vetting Agency, said no, don't appoint him. We don't know on what grounds, but your tip about speech about Hong Kong is, I'm sure that kind of thing was at the heart of it. Olly Robinson cleared Mandelson. This is because Olly Robinson would have known that going to Number 10 post an appointment saying, I'm terribly sorry, kid, the Mandelson appointment just can't happen. It's, that was politically impossible. So Olly Robbins is making it clear he didn't tell people one part of the verdict because it would have been inappropriate and he couldn't. It's that the big row is all about. It's not even quite clear what Olly Robbins saw in all of this. But the bottom line is that Number 10 wanted Peter Mandelson in that post, come what may. They rammed it through. By contrast, Number 10's case is that Robbins could and should have told the PM and presumably asks us to believe and I'd be interested whether we do believe this, asks us to believe that at that stage, if Keir Starmer had been told of the UK SV decision, then the appointment would have been cancelled. Do you think that's credible? Do you think that if Keir Starmer had been told that piece of information at that point, despite everything in the past, that would have been the course of action? And what do you think the fallout is today?
Yeah, that's a great counterfactual. We can't know, can we? We could only say, I suppose, at that point, the stakes would have been raised so high politically for Keir Starmer. You could imagine him saying, "We're going to pause this appointment and take another look at it." But in fact, the opposite happened, and as you rightly point out, everything about this was like, just get this over the line. Everyone knew that he, or at least Morgan McSweeney, wanted Peter Mandelson in Washington. That had been made clear. There was going to be no extension for Dame Karen Pierce, and on it was supposed to go. So I think that rush factor just simply explains a lot here. I'd also say props to Andrew MacDonald at the Politico Playbook this morning for the haiku headline, simply Sir Humphrey versus Sir Keir. And this is all going very legal on that score, that kind of institutional fallout between the Foreign Office and Number 10. Now, we know that Robbins is looking for a big payoff. Remember, Peter Mandelson also attempted that from the Foreign Office, though he got quite a small one. But anyway, the employment lawyers definitely the winners here. Government spinners last night are sharing a new explanatory note on the implications of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, not something that they drew a lot of attention to previously, one should say, but they think that it shows that there is no law that would have stopped civil servants, aka Robbins, flagging recommendations from UK SV security vetting to ministers. That means Robbins did have the opportunity to let someone know around the Prime Minister, or let ministers know, however directly or indirectly, about the ruling against Peter Mandelson on security grounds. Now, this is really controversial, Sam, because this is getting already a lot of pushback from civil servants that I've been speaking to, and some former holders of the Robbins role, who are just saying, come on, this thing of suddenly producing a legal note to say, oh no, this is what this all really meant is in this case, I think they think it's instrumental. They think it's Keir Starmer sort of playing lawyers to get himself out of trouble. And it is pointed out to me that if you look at the phrasing of this opinion, and Number 10 have put it out, there's a link to it, you can read it, is that it is passive, i.e. there isn't a law that if I don't tell Sam Coates something, it means I could have told Sam Coates something. There was nothing stopping me, but it does not therefore mean that I'm at fault if I don't. So I think even when it comes to issuing this legal opinion, it just takes it to the next level, doesn't it? It's everybody's got a lawyer here, right?
Absolutely. I am confused by the big picture strategy of Keir Starmer here, because it comes back to some of the things we were just listening to in that pool interview that I did. Effectively, the big picture case of Keir Starmer is, I'm not totally in control of my government, and that there were lots of bad things and I just happen not to see them. And none of that is good. Instead, the route that Number 10 is going down is to drown us with people going toe to toe in process wars, on the basis of this protocol or that protocol. I'm not sure anybody is the winner, and I'm not sure it makes Keir Starmer look strong, even though you can see the kind of top of government whizzing around, presumably with Antonio Romeo's help, swinging into action. But so too, because this is a process war, our team Olly Robbins, and they've got a new piece of evidence as well that they're going to rely on heavily. Now, this is something that a Foreign Office minister said at the dispatch box in the Commons 5 days after Peter Mandelson was sacked. So this is Stephen Doughty in the Commons, and he said that the UK security vetting reports go to the department, the Foreign Office, and they manage the risks from that point. And then Stephen Doughty says, importantly, the national security vetting process is rightly independent of ministers who are not informed of any findings other than the final outcome. Exactly the same procedures were followed in this case. So there you have it, Anne. And I actually think this pretty big piece of evidence in Olly Robbins' favour. You've got a Foreign Office minister reading into the record up at the dispatch box without query or challenge that Robbins followed the correct procedure and that you couldn't, if you're in Robbins' position, have informed anybody about any part of the vetting process. And didn't blink, didn't think that there was a problem with that, clearly reflecting the view at the time. So whatever post hoc legal advice team number 10 can come up with, that was not the view at the time. And the question for the Employment Tribunal, as well as the Court of Public Opinion, is, did Robbins act fairly or not? And look, the minister in the relevant department said this was the right thing to do. And so that is fairly open and shut, I would have thought.
Also, just going back to your phrasing that you highlight there, Sam, who are not informed of any findings other than the final outcome. So it does certainly strongly imply that there was a route to the final outcome, which was a kind of red light, which was a tick in the no box on the security vetting for Mandelson, that there was a means for that to reach ministers. I mean, it just says it in black and white. But let's turn perhaps to the raw politics of this. I was talking to a senior cabinet source about it over the weekend. I mean, their view, and I think it does speak for a lot of those around the cabinet table with the Prime Minister, is that they think the lapses on the Foreign Office side here are serious enough, whether the blame comes down exclusively to Olly Robbins or to that relationship with the vetting office inside the Cabinet Office. As you say, that's process wars, but in the end, it's somebody's scalp is going to be bigger than somebody else's scalp. And they think that Starmer is actually pretty safe and that he's confident about what he's going to say in the Commons today to that effect. And his cabinet also not really prepared for anything that would follow turning against him at the moment on this issue. A detail here, the news that Angela Rayner and Andy Burnham held talks up in the Northwest on Friday night at her house was, this source says, baking in what will happen if this were to become life-threatening for the Prime Minister. But that image of Burnham arriving chez Angela in a silver Mercedes, looking like that they thought this was a moment that could advance an alternative to Keir Starmer. That sent some chills down ministerial spines, because there are enough Starmer centrists in this government who may not be wild fans of the Prime Minister, but they know that life could get very eventful indeed in the event of another attempt to oust the Prime Minister. This minister saying the last attempt in February taught a lot of unquiet MPs what it feels like to be asked to pull the trigger. And in the end, they didn't do it then, and they won't do it now. So, that is, it's a bit like saying, well, it's just too much trouble at the moment, May elections and all that, to even think of turning on the Prime Minister. But, from his point of view, that's better this week than it could be curtains.
Oh, absolutely. I've got the same set of facts, but a slightly different emphasis. Going around a few MPs yesterday, look, they're still morose, the word I used on Friday, pretty jumpy about what's happened. But it is 2 weeks before the local elections. And I think that's one of the big reasons why right now there won't be the kind of revolt that you could have get. One Labour MP said to me, just like baffled by Number 10's approach. Their line is they didn't know. His line is he couldn't tell them. Isn't that a win-win? Is that kind of what are they up to sense that's particularly perplexing people? Maybe there is still some kind of revolt against Keir Starmer, some kind of challenge post-local elections. Another moment that could be difficult for him because of a change of circumstance would be in the autumn when the National Executive Committee changes. And that could be a moment that makes it much, much easier for Andy Burnham to get a seat in Parliament. Here's a fact for you, Anne, I didn't know. Jonathan Ashworth, formerly of this parish, recovering sadly from a stroke over Christmas, but is dipping his toe back into politics. He's standing for the National Executive Committee, a seat that he's long held once again this time. So he could be back on in Labour politics soon. But I think it's not the case that Labour MPs have given up on a challenge. That it's just the ones I talk to say now is just not the time because of the elections. Right, one last thing. We have to get under our belt your intel on Planet Kemi. Take it away.
Thank you. I feel like I've got to live up to that now. There are a lot of reshuffle rumours around about what the Tories will do. After May the 7th, they're looking to reform, performing pretty well then. We talked a lot about where this leaves the Starmer project, but I think there will be some talk about where it leaves the Kemi project. Now, I am hearing that she is weighing a big generational shift in her front bench, and that would be really the first time, if you think about it, she kind of adapted when she came into people who'd backed her, but also to the fact that she needed to reach across the aisle. She did a kind of compromise-led appointment to her front bench. I think it would be fair to say that there have been some strong performances, but they haven't really cut through. And I think they know that. And I think she's now much better at taking advice on that. So where she's possibly going to end up is a shift of Mel Stride from Shadow Chancellor. I know Mel and his team, as avid listeners to this podcast, will probably be in touch saying this is nonsense. But anyway, so last time Mel Stride saw off a challenge from Andrew Griffith as the potential Shadow Chancellor. It went to him. I'm hearing this time it might be neither of them who ends up in the role, but Claire Coutinho, who is currently in the energy brief and making some waves there. I think she is ambitious to move up. I think there's just generally an appetite to move on from the Boris party. So that puts people like Chris Philps and Priti Patel in the danger zone to be moved or even out of the front bench there entirely. And the idea is to make room for impatient rising stars like Katie Lamb, hard to miss Katie Lamb, and Jack Rankin, who's spoken a lot about the Conservatives' lack of appeal to voters in their 20s and their 30s as they're getting established in their lives. And Reform are getting stuck into a younger demographic. Kemi Badenoch obviously feels she might need an answering bid. Let's see what happens.
Fascinating stuff. A complete overhaul there, potentially in prospect. It could be quite difficult for the Tories immediately after the May elections. That is certainly one answer. Okay, big set of calls, big set of predictions, Anne. We'll come back to that when we see more happen. It's a huge day. We will be back tomorrow for Politics at 7 and on Tuesday. See you then.
Buckle up.